Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate, and today is Friday, June 21st. And I'll just give a bit of an update before we go to our guests on this very exciting topic of the Croton Aqueduct and, frankly, the potential of mankind, which we are threatening to annihilate, and that's what I really would like to start with. I just got the latest Substack essay from Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, former U.S. Marines intelligence officer, titled "It's the End of the World as We Know It." And on June 12th, I was able to attend a press conference, which was organized by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. In fact, we discussed that on the symposium last Friday, where you had Colonel Wilkerson, you had Scott Ritter, and you had Colonel Richard Black and Helga Zepp-LaRouche all trying to break into the American press and American mindset that we are marching very quickly over an abyss into thermonuclear annihilation, self-annihilation. And this is not because Putin is a madman. If he were a madman, we might not be here already. He's been extremely restrained, given the provocations coming from NATO and the West. But you have had a series of escalatory moves, particularly since Ukraine is losing. And it's going to be clear that Ukraine has lost this war, as everyone who looked at a map or knew anything about history would have known from the beginning. But unfortunately for President Biden, it's going to be obvious that Ukraine has lost the war before the November elections. So how to hide that? Well, you threaten the use of nuclear weapons, of course. So first you had President Macron threatening to send ground troops to Ukraine. The French military said this was absurd, and clearly the voters of France are not that thrilled with his leadership. He's been forced now to call snap elections on June 30th. And actually, my colleague and fellow LaRouche associate, Jacques Cheminade, who is the head of party Solidarité et Progrès, is running for office for the district represented its French citizens living in particular parts of the world, in this case, Asia, I believe in North Africa. So this is really a powerful intervention that he will be running for office with a whole slate of candidates associated with this movement for peace. But to continue, so you had these bellicose remarks from Macron. Then we had Biden giving the nod to Ukraine to use American weapons to strike targets deep inside Russia, including killing Russian civilians, which Ukraine has now been doing, killing Russian civilians inside Russia, and knocking out, or not necessarily knocking out, but damaging a Russian radar early warning system. And I will tell you, I was interviewed on RT yesterday, and I heard the conclusion of Putin's press conference in Vietnam, translated into English, where they were asking him about whether Russia was going to have to launch a preemptive first strike, or was Russia changing its nuclear doctrine. And what President Putin said is, well, right now, the West knows that if they launch a first strike, that we will be able to destroy them in a second strike. But of course, if that changes, and you can think of people from the Biden administration who said that we could do a disarming strike, in other words, to eliminate the Russian ability to respond, which is probably not really possible, but is something that they're talking about. So imagine what the Russians think when there is an attack on their early warning radar system, which would blind them to an incoming missile and would mean that they wouldn't be able to launch a second strike. It is under these conditions that Russia would use a nuclear weapon if it's an existential threat to Russia. So at the moment, Putin has expressed confidence that they still have the ability to launch a second strike. Unlike the United States, Russia has a written policy that they will not use a first nuclear strike. So does China. The United States, which is the only nation on the planet that has used nuclear weapons on two civilian populations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has no such comment. Now, to go on, we had widely reported in the London Telegraph, I guess, an interview with Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, who said that NATO members were consulting about deploying more nuclear weapons, taking them out of storage and placing them on standby. This is a quote from Stoltenberg. I won't go into operational details about how many nuclear warheads should be operational and which should be stored, but we need to consult on these issues, unquote. So this is, of course, complete insanity if you are a rational human being. What human being wants to risk the annihilation of the entire planet? But that is what these crazy people are talking about. So Putin, in his visits to both North Korea, where he signed, including military agreements, and Vietnam, is working both to outflank the West and to try and get some people in the UK, in NATO, in the United States to wake up and realize that he is not bluffing, that we are creating an extremely dangerous situation and negotiations have to be held. And it is also very alarming that apparently our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is under orders that he is not to speak directly with Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. So if you're on a precipice and then you cut off conversation, it's extremely dangerous. So I wanted to start with that because that is the state of affairs. That's the context in which we have this election situation, which I have to say is really rather silly as a candidate, and I go to all kinds of events, and the kind of questions people ask me indicate that they are not in reality. I don't get asked questions about my plans to prevent a thermonuclear war. When we were petitioning, I very rarely, it began to happen more, got questions on where did I stand on the genocide occurring in Gaza. We have to get the American people into reality. Now, finally, before we go to our guests, I just wanted to say that there is an article. We have launched a campaign, and I think I'll just show you, if I can share my screen here, a leaflet that I wrote. My fellow candidate, Jose Vega, has written one as well. So you can see it says, "Is your vote for sale? George Latimer is." And I begin, "The residents of New York 16 can deliver a shot heard round the world by preventing AIPAC and Hillary Clinton from purchasing the congressional seat currently held by Jamal Bowman for $25 million and giving it to genocide apologist George Latimer." For people who may not be aware of this around the country, the 16th Congressional District in New York is the seat held by Jamal Bowman, who was one of the first congressmen to call for a ceasefire. We have had many disagreements with him on many issues, but as soon as he called for this, the next thing you know, AIPAC was pouring $14 million into this district to take away people's choice, to stifle debate, and to get a guy, the Westchester County Executive, George Latimer, who wasn't interested in running for Congress, to persuade him to run. Now, I put at the end of my statement something which I think is very important, which is a quote from George Washington's farewell address. And I think it's worth remembering both when we consider our hostility toward Russia and our softness toward Israel. And I wouldn't even say it's toward Israel. Israel is destroying itself. It's self-destructing. But the Netanyahu fanatical faction that we seem to be interested in having as a hand grenade to throw when we need to disrupt international affairs. George Washington wrote, "The nation which indulges toward another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest." So he saw this coming quite some time ago. And I'll just show you, this is the leaflet put out by Jose Vega, Reject AIPAC and Reject War. And then there's another statement that he's written, "The Bronx has never accepted slavery." We just had Juneteenth on Wednesday of this week, the day that the slaves in the South finally got to know that Abraham Lincoln had abolished slavery 6 months earlier. And we have a situation in New York where people don't know who their candidates are, or candidates are disappeared before they get on the ballot. It's very similar. People who have the power like to keep others in the dark. So we are making this a very big issue to defeat AIPAC, to stop this. If voters want to complain about how they don't feel like their congressman represents them, then if you're in the 16th Congressional District, Westchester County area in New York State, you better vote this Tuesday against George Latimer. We cannot have him win the primary because this is a complete charade. It's just a face in front of a bunch of money for a genocidal policy. And I know that our mobilization has caught attention because today an article came out in the Times of Israel, very freaked out, claiming that Congressman Bowman was lying when he said there was genocide. 85% of the world's population considers what's happening in Gaza genocide. And they have allegedly 700 volunteers. Now, we met one of their volunteers when I was in Mount Vernon the other day, and the volunteer was getting paid $60 an hour. So there's no such thing as volunteers. And he was actually very funny because when we confronted him, he said, "Well, I just want you to know I'm not actually distributing the literature. I'm not actually doing what I'm paid to do." So so they don't have volunteers. They have a ton of money, and they're paying people to go around, particularly in the more affluent, what they claim the Jewish areas, to get the Jewish people out to vote. Now, anyone who's been talking to people on the streets, like people with my campaign, knows that actually the Jewish population of New York is quite divided. I was told in Manhattan on the Upper West Side that the synagogues are divided 50-50 for wanting a ceasefire. So you cannot presume that because someone goes to synagogue, because someone happens to be Jewish, that they believe that Israel has the right to kill 40,000 plus Palestinians, largely women and children, or engage in collective punishment. This is the assumption that they are making, which we intend to have backfire on them. So we'll see that there's a lot of activity this weekend. There are rallies all over the place, and the issue is AIPAC. So that being said, I just want to say that in the last couple of days, there's been an indication that perhaps this a thoughtless slaughter may be nearing its end. The spokesman for the Israeli army publicly said that Hamas cannot be defeated, that its an ideology. It is not a group of people to be annihilated. And of course, this is the direct opposite of what Netanyahu has said. Benny Gantz has left the cabinet saying, I'm not going to stay here if you don't have a plan. Well, what do we do if this ends? And as people who've watched my symposium know, that you have to have a plan for peace, which is frankly beyond a political plan. And often, if you try to get the political agreement first, you will fail. And it has been LaRouche's approach and that of his wife that you need the economic agreement. Obviously, we need a ceasefire. We need the recognition of a Palestinian state. The United Nations Resolution 242 in 1967 is the internationally recognized 1967 borders. That is a legitimate starting point. But then what? Are all the refugees from Gaza going to just go back and live in rubble or refugee camps? No one should ever live in a refugee camp ever again. Gaza needs modern new cities. It needs transportation, and most importantly, the entire region needs water. So this is what we're going to be discussing tonight. And I have two guests, my husband, Chris Sayre, who has written an article in the New Federalist paper about the Croton Aqueduct project, and also engineer and expert on some of the things involved in this, Nash Hassan, who is a rather prolific author, actually. I've only just started glancing at one of his books, who also happened to work on this very project in the recent period. So I think, Chris, are you the one who is supposed to start? And then we will hear from Nash. And I'd like to welcome both of you here and make my usual disclaimer that participating in the symposium does not constitute endorsement of any political campaign. It doesn't constitute non-endorsement, but this is for the purpose of educating the electorate. And I think this is really important, because if we don't get some inspiration out there, I think the world situation is going to get people pretty depressed. So welcome both of you. And Chris, go ahead.
Thank you very much. All right, let me just get set up here. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides that I put together. All right, there we go. Can that be seen? Okay, great. All right, so well, first of all, just to say that yeah, I wrote an article that was in the Diane's newspaper, the New Federalist, I guess a year ago. But I went through it again and put together a slideshow to accompany it. And I want to go through the material that was in that article. I think you'll find these slides very, very interesting. I certainly did. And also, just to say, I'm looking forward to what Nash has to present and our dialogue on this, because we spoke last night for, I don't know, certainly a half an hour, and just had a wonderful, delightful discussion. And I think what will happen in this discussion is that various things that we talked about will come out. And I would ask you to keep in mind that Diane has called for a bill to be introduced called the Swords into Plowshares Act of 2024. Swords into Plowshares. So just keep that in mind as we go through the material here. So this is a picture of Manhattan, and it may not be the way that you normally see Manhattan. It's on its side here, but as you can see, you have the ocean coming out the bay here, Manhattan is surrounded by brackish water. So if you have a city that is going to require water for, 100,000 people, 500,000 people, 1 million people, 2 million people, you're going to need to figure out how to get that water there. And unlike other cities, fortunately or unfortunately, New York is surrounded by brackish water, salt water. So you're not going to get it right from the rivers around it. So this was a problem that had to be solved. The city of Philadelphia did not have that problem. The Schuylkill was fresh water, and Philadelphia went with a public water system. And as you can see from this illustration here, a very beautiful public water system. This was the water system that they built that is modeled on classical Greek architecture. So that's one way to solve a problem with beauty. But what happened in New York City was a little different. It took a while to figure out what they were going to do. Now, on August 2nd, 1799, there was an act for supplying the city of New York with pure and wholesome water. It was signed into law, and Aaron Burr's company, the Manhattan Company, won the contract. This company was to be capitalized at $2 million. Now, there was a little stipulation put into the bill that said, there's a provision that says, it shall be lawful for the said company to employ all such surplus capital in the purchase of public or other stock or in any moneyed transactions for the sole benefit of the said company. That's peculiar. You would think that a company that was involved in providing water for the city would be committed to the public good, not to private profits. But that was put in there. So much for supplying clean water to the city. Aaron Burr actually started a bank instead. This was the bank that was rivaling the only other state chartered bank at the time, Alexander Hamilton's Bank of New York. The Manhattan Company's operating concept was to get water from the collect pond, which was down at the very tip of Manhattan. It was once a freshwater pond on the island, but it had become rather foul as the surrounding area became inhabited. So as fetid as it may have been, getting water from the more distant sources would require infrastructure, and that would cut into the profits of the Manhattan Company. Burr wanted to expend as little capital as possible, but still give the appearance of fulfilling the contract so as not to, quote, incite a violent clamor against us. That's a quote. Now, this is the same Aaron Burr who on July, just to show you, these are the pipes that they used. These are wooden pipes that fit together. So very, very, very cheap. The cheapest of materials that would leak, that roots could get into, that were just as cheap as possible in order to maximize profits. Now, this is the same Aaron Burr who shoots Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804. So he is as treasonous as he is avaricious. And he also, when he was vice president with Thomas Jefferson, actually tried to organize a splitting of the nation. He was involved in an operation to split the country west of the Mississippi off from the United States. So he actually had to flee the country when this treason was shown, and he went to England for a while. So let me just see here. For the next 30 years, the Manhattan Company used its monopoly. The company maintained its monopoly to control the water rights of Manhattan, but a change was coming. This was the water reserve, and you'll see in comparison later another water reserve, but this was the water reserve that the Manhattan Company had created. So you can see it's not only very small, but imagine that the water that's going in there is not exactly fresh. But the change that was coming was the presidencies of James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. James Monroe became president in 1816. The Second National Bank had just been brought back into existence, and John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. And then John Quincy Adams became president after two terms of James Monroe in 1824. Now, Monroe transformed the country. This is called the era of good feelings, because we were coming out of the War of 1812. We were happy that we we're still a nation at that point. And Monroe basically decided that it was the role of the federal government to, unlike the Jeffersonians, Monroe, who came from those same circles, nonetheless broke with them and decided that it was the role of the federal government to invest in infrastructure, that the general welfare clause and the necessary and proper clauses of the Constitution allowed the federal government to invest in great public works, and that by 1824, under the General Survey Act, the Army Corps of Engineers from West Point was given the mission of going throughout the nation and mapping the nation and looking at where we could make great internal improvements in the nation. Canals, ports, later on railroads. So we'll get to that. West Point was founded in 1802, overlooking the Hudson River, and it became an American School of Engineering. New York State was the first classroom for its development. And Governor DeWitt Clinton, who was also mayor of New York City at one point, he led the way to this breakthrough in massive infrastructure projects. Here you see him pouring water from Lake Erie into the Hudson River after having taken a canal boat all the way from Buffalo to Albany on the Erie Canal, a 363-mile canal. And one funny thing about it is that early on, DeWitt Clinton had been pushing for this policy as early as the late 1810, 1811. And he went to Thomas Jefferson and he proposed this. And Jefferson said, "You might as well propose to me that we go to the moon. This is not possible to do now." Well, in 1817, New York State floated bonds and they started digging, and they did build this massive canal that completely transformed New York State. It created the potential for entirely new cities, as we know, all across the Erie Canal. New York City became an incredibly important port city. It was the trading hub for all of the goods produced throughout not only the state of New York, but of course this opened up the entire Great Lakes region. And many, many immigrants who came into New York City then spread throughout the Midwest, and Chicago and Detroit and different cities became incredibly industrially productive as well as agricultural. So this transformed the country. So this paved the way for the great projects that may have seemed impossible at the time. So in 1832, a terrible cholera epidemic hit New York. So it became clear that the Manhattan Company was not exactly supplying clean water. If you were wealthy, if you had money, you could get water that was wheeled in from outside. But if you were not, if you were poor, you were dependent on the water that the Manhattan Company provided. So the poor were getting cholera. And at this point, DeWitt Clinton Jr., a member of the U.S. Corps of Topographical Engineers out of the Army Corps of Engineers, he was a visionary promoter of great internal improvements like his father was. He proved the efficacy of bringing, quote, a copious and inexhaustible supply of pure and wholesome water at a reasonable expense down from the Croton River. Clinton stated that Manhattan Island may soon be the home to 1 million souls. And he found it, quote, a matter of surprise and profound regret that a city of such importance as New York would not have sufficient water. He stated that the problem lay in, quote, the powers and immunities granted to the Manhattan Company, an extraneous but powerful influence which not only exerts itself in this wide community, but in our legislative halls. This is you see here the document which gives him the go-ahead to start to develop this great project that he proposes. He pointed out that the charter for the Manhattan Company was perpetual, granting the company the control over the streams and springs of the island of New York and the county of Westchester. And so, and quoting the Water Committee report of 1831, have been more intent in making money by their banking operations than accomplishing the avowed objects of their charter, and have left the city totally unsupplied with water, which can be called pure and wholesome. End of quote. At this point, not long after the Manhattan Company monopoly was broken. It was broken on February 26, 1833, with the passage of a new law to supply Manhattan with pure and wholesome water. A bold plan was laid out by West Point's David Bates Douglas. He was an engineer from West Point, and he was commissioned to build an aqueduct linking the Croton River, some 40 miles north of New York, to reservoirs that would be built in the city. So David Bates Douglas had also worked on the Erie Canal, and he was also the architect and the chief engineer for the Morris Canal in New Jersey. So you can see coming out of West Point, a school of engineers that are now spreading out throughout the nation to bring economic development to the nation. And the role of government was to do this. The role of government, you may have had private companies that were involved in doing these things, contracts, etc. There were bids that were put out, no problem. But the federal government was directly involved with a vision and a mission to develop the internal improvements of the nation. Very, very important. So here you can see what this looked like, and 41 miles long, bringing water from Croton River, which became Croton Lake once they built the dam, which you'll see in a minute. And you can see some of the arching here. This is a double arch on Ossining on the Hudson that was built. So magnificent infrastructure projects for that time to bring fresh water there. So this was a great undertaking, and they were gonna bring reservoirs into the city. You'll see these reservoirs, and the whole idea was that this would be for a rapidly growing population. Remember, Clinton Jr.'s idea that soon there'd be 1 million people in New York. Now there's 1 million people in Manhattan now in 2024. He was talking about this in 1831, 1 million people. Very, very forward looking. So whatever politics may have been involved, it's not clear to me what happens at this point. But there is a devastating fire in 1835 in the city. Massive amounts of property are destroyed. I believe only 2 human beings perished in this fire, amazingly enough. That's what I heard. But nonetheless, about 1/10 of the buildings were destroyed. So it was felt that Douglas, who was doing a lot of studies on what would be the best plan for this, that it was felt he was moving too slowly, and he was replaced by John Bloomfield Jervis, who was not an Army Corps engineer, but nonetheless had developed his engineering skills on the Erie Canal under the guidance of Army Corps engineers. He also was the chief engineer for the Delaware and Hudson Canal, which brought anthracite coal from Honesdale and different places in Pennsylvania across New York to the Hudson, similar to the Morris Canal that brought anthracite coal across New Jersey. And so Jervis was brought in, and even in the midst of the banking crisis, the panic of 1837 under Martin Van Buren, because they destroyed Jackson and Van Buren destroyed the Second National Bank in 1836. They took it down. So there was a panic in 1837. Jervis, nonetheless, was working with Army Corps engineer Edmund French, Columbia University engineers Henry T. Anthony and Horatio Allen to build this remarkable piece of infrastructure. When completed, the Croton Water Works consisted of a 50-foot high dam on the Croton River. And you'll see later on, I'll tell you something about this dam, but you can see there's a nice curvature to it. So just keep that in mind. So it was a 50-foot high dam. It created a lake of 400 acres, 500 million gallons of water. This water would flow through an aqueduct 41 miles long and be carried over the East River on a bridge 1,450 feet long. Here you can see how they built the tunnels, and there's a path over top of it that people could walk on. So it was like a path, but there's a tunnel underneath that's built, and the water comes through this tunnel. So this is an amazing engineering feat. And here you can see some of the infrastructure that they did. If you had another river underneath, they would build the aqueduct over top of it. Very, very beautiful architecture. This is the East River Bridge that carried the water, 1,450 feet long, 138 feet above high tide, consisting of 16 arches. The bridge was supported on piers sunk deep into the riverbed using new technologies to pound these pylons deep into the ground. It was developed by Jervis. Once the water arrived in Manhattan, it would be conveyed through over 6,000 feet of tunnels into 2 reservoirs, one in what is now Central Park with a capacity of 150 million gallons. And the second, you can see here the schematic of them, of Manhattan pumping, the water going across Manhattan. And then this is the Murray Hill distribution reservoir with 20 million gallons. So the one in Central Park, which I don't have a picture of, was even bigger. But this was Murray Hill, 20 million gallons. In contrast, the largest capacity reservoir Burr's Manhattan project ever built, that one that you saw earlier, had only a 500,000 gallon capacity and filled with putrid water at that. So the patriotic West Point foundry, located across the Hudson River from West Point, had won the bid to produce the iron pipes, not wooden pipes that would rot, but iron pipes for water distribution. The foundry was also the center of production for locomotives designed by Jervis and Allen as a major part of the infrastructure improvement of the nation. I'll just go back to one picture here just to show you. This railroad here was designed by Jervis, so he was an engineer of many, many talents and skills. And this engine was known as the DeWitt Clinton. All right, so now in 1841, just as the Croton Dam had been completed and the entire water delivery system was to be opened, a terrible storm ripped through the area, dumping so much water that the dam was unable to hold, and it broke apart. In 1841, it broke apart. So they had to remarkably, most of the aqueduct remained intact. Jervis had to start from scratch on a new dam at that point. And he came up with an S-shaped design that would ease the water down to the stilling basin. And this reverse curve and stilling basin had never been used in the United States before, but this crisis that he had in 41 forced him to come up with a new engineering plan. And this became standard in future dams. So here you see, in preparation for the delivery of large amounts of fresh water through the city, a fountain was built. Here you see the fountain in Union Square. On October 14th, 1842, as water shot up through the fountain, a great celebration engulfed the city, described by the former mayor and a promoter of internal improvements, Philip Hone. The public gardens, theaters, and fountains completed the great celebration of the triumph of Croton water. It was certainly a great affair, but nothing struck me with more pleasure and surprise than the perfect order and propriety which prevailed among the immense masses of male and female spectators on the route of the procession. Not a drunken person was to be seen. The moral as well as the physical influence of water pervaded everything. The people stood and looked on, delighted and unfatigued during the 3 hours occupied in the passage of the pageant. It was a day for New Yorkers to be proud of. So that's, and it was a day for the whole country to be proud, obviously. Now, I want to introduce Nash at this point to come in, because I've taken it up to the completion of the first Croton project. Nash has written a number of books, A Pursuit of Happiness, which of course is one of my favorite ideas from the Declaration of Independence, and the durability and sustainability of concrete, which is a very, very important thing if you're going to build water projects and infrastructure. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Nash Hassan.
Thank you for introducing me, and Diane, so for bringing forward my work, which I did, during COVID, by the way. COVID made it possible to write these two books. So, yeah, I've been engineer with the New York-based company Ebasco Services Incorporated, which was founded in 1906 by General Electric to bring power to the United States, to the homes of the United States. And so they were able to deliver power over the years. And in the 1970s, when the nuclear era started, so they were able to, go into nuclear business. And And somehow at the end of 80s, the nuclear demise occurred, and we went into more infrastructure projects. And at that time, I guess it was Ibasco Services, and we were, this project of water supply to New York City, we were given to upgrade the power, hydro services and the dams and the distribution system. So just imagine that this took about 150 years. The project was made with such quality that it really did not require too many improvements until 150 years later, when some of the equipment, mechanical equipment, the valves had to be replaced. And you mentioned, Chris, the sloping portion of the dam is called spillway. So that's where the water spills over the dam, and there were some issues with the spillway quality because, see, way back, what happened in the 80s, the concrete did not contain air inside. So it was not durable for under freezing conditions. So you have series of freezing and thawing conditions, the concrete could fall apart. So we had to improve the quality of the spillways, and then also introduce some fuse plug spillways in case water was rising above the dam, so that it would not erode the dam completely. So additional spillway capacity was added. So just to give you an idea of the cost of the project, which we did, was only $120 million over a period of 15 years, from 1991 to 2008. And we were taken over by, in 1995, Ibasco was taken over by Raytheon engineers. When they sort of, after 5 years, they decided this is not their cup of tea, where being an engineering company. So they sold it to Washington Group International, and so who helped us to develop more infrastructure projects within the country, including other dams and hydro projects. So I think, in brief, the imagination that this project had for the city of New York can be summed up in one way: that it is able to feed, the same water is able to feed the entire population of New York City, which is over 9 million people. So it is amazing that the foresight the engineers had to build a project which will last over 200 years almost. So that's, and it was an engineering feat. The aqueduct brought the water, but then eventually and it's amazing that when we fixed the projects, the facade of the dams, it used granite stones, and the New York City authorities wanted to replace with better quality precast concretes, and we found out that the granite was as good. We had to just fix up some of the joints and repairs, but generally it has withheld. So the quality of the workmanship those days were remarkable. And also to add, this was built by, I'm looking in the history, about 4,000 immigrants built this infrastructure projects in the 1800s and 1900s. So it's a remarkable feat. And I think one more thing I want to add: one of the reservoirs in the city was located where the New York Public Library is, on the 42nd Street. So that was one of the reservoirs which housed water for distribution for the city. And then I guess in the 1920s, the project was expanded to serve the Queens and Staten Island area also. So there were tunnels were added, and the water came to Staten Island, far from the original source through tunnels. And there were reservoirs created within Staten Island on the Clove Hill Lake. So it's really to emphasize the role of the government in foreseeing and steering projects of large magnitudes for the long-term benefit of the people. So I guess is remarkable. And I hope, there's a need the infrastructure is falling apart. I know, as you see, the bridges and and the dams and need to be, replaced and upgraded. And a bill has been passed, over $1 trillion for the infrastructure projects, but the progress, is very slow, and I hope, it can be accelerated, before we see too much of a problem, with the global warming and other issues. So I guess what else I can add? The main thing is the engineers, when I look back, I've been with the company for over 44 years and retired recently, but the dedication was there. The companies were committed for the benefit of the real. Of course, the money, profit was a motive, but it was a secondary thing. The main thing was to really build a quality project which will last and for years to come. And so that is very important, for the health of the country. And our company built some nuclear projects 30, 40 years ago. They are still functioning, in Louisiana and St. Louis and Florida and North Carolina. So if things are done right and if competent people are involved, I think the project's longevity is guaranteed. So I hope this we can continue. Lately there's a need for mergers of companies, where a bigger fish is buying a smaller fish, and sometimes there's a disregard to the quality of the work, and its focus is mostly making, profit margins, to increase the profit margins. Hopefully, so that should be secondary. First thing is to really build a project which is durable and bring quality and benefits to the general public. I guess.
Thanks.
I wanted to just show, if I could, let me see here. There we go. So this, just to give you a sense of, the Nash had sent me this map on the right-hand side, which is a detailed, mapping of the reservoirs. And here I found this picture from NYC Environmental Protection, which shows the Croton watershed. And now you can see how small that is in comparison to the rest of the system that has been, added in over the years above it.
That's right. Yeah, that's called the Catskill Reservoir System. There's like a second backup system to the water supply system. And in addition, there's another one, the Delaware Water Gap, which is on the other side. So it's not shown here in this map. I'm not sure. So they're really three-tier system for backup, which assure, continuous supply of water for many years to come to the city. As the population grows, and the quality of water in New York is still the best quality in the whole state, United States. We can still drink it from the tap without adding anything, and which is remarkable.
Yeah. I think the Delaware watershed is there way up in the upper.
Okay.
It looks like it's out by Port Jervis, which is named after John Jervis, by the way.
Right.
And then here's the
tunnels to the Brooklyn. I see the Richmond Tunnel.
Map.
Yeah, the Richmond Tunnel, and which bring the water to Staten Island. Incidentally, the city is building a third tunnel in Queens right now, which is coming out very slowly. Unfortunately, a lot of construction issues. But anyway, so that's going to supplement, water supply distribution further.
Nash, when we were talking last night, I found it really fascinating that the company that you worked for, Eb, Ebco,
Ibasco.
Ibasco, was taken over by Raytheon.
Right.
And Suzanne pointed out that this was in 1993, and this was when there was.
Chris,
Huh?
can you stop sharing so we can see you and Nash?
Oh, sure, sorry. In 1993, that there was a peace dividend because it was the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had fallen 4 years prior, and the Cold War was over. And so companies like Raytheon, Grumman, any number of these quote unquote military industrial complex companies, which are obviously a huge reservoir of engineering skills, just put into the wrong efforts. But then so Raytheon was involved in the development of the water system for New York City. I had no idea about that. I don't think most New Yorkers know that. And then they decided to sell it because, as you pointed out, they weren't making the kind of profits that they wanted on the water. But I found that fascinating, and I think we were talking that this is what has to happen now, is the reverse. That we need to turn swords into plowshares, as Diane Sayre is calling for in her Senate campaign. Because otherwise we're looking at nuclear war and human annihilation. And as you said, we're falling apart. Our infrastructure is falling apart.
We have to come. I mean, we were talking about that Tokamak project, Chris. So I mean, that was initiated, and that was a great project. And I think I was involved with that project to have a borated concrete, so to stop, as a shield for gamma rays coming out of the plant. So, but somehow it didn't develop far enough. So I think there's a need for new technologies, nuclear power, really for a sustainable power. That's what we need, and hopefully the government can guide us, and sort of take the initiative rather than depending on the public, which is not it is primarily motivated by profits, not really the long-term benefit of the country.
I think this is really important. I'll just give one example that everyone's seeing right now about how money per se dictates policy as opposed to policy dictating the credit that needs to be issued, which was Alexander Hamilton's idea. Look at what has just happened with the congestion pricing. Now, this was a completely insane idea, which was that everyone who drove south of 59th Street was going to have to pay $15. It would have turned the northern part of Manhattan and Bergen County, New Jersey, and other places into parking lots. And a lot of companies I know were going to shut down. I don't know what the trucks would have done delivering food and groceries. So finally, since it's an election year, probably this stupid plan was abandoned. Well, what was the purpose of it? Supposedly to raise money to pay for the MTA. So now we read that the modernization, the upgrade of I think Harlem subway station, 125th Street and 2nd Avenue or something, which was supposed to be funded by this, is now not going to happen. Now, you think about the absurdity of this when the Senate just voted to send $95 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, which will kill people, which give no net benefit to the American people, excepting it keeps some people employed who could be employed doing engineering for things that we actually need. And I'm sure that the cost of the upgrades to the MTA are not anywhere near $95 billion. But people say, oh, you have to balance the budget. They have no understanding of economy. And I think the other thing I wanted to say is the quality of mind when you're looking at Manhattan, this new city, New Amsterdam, as it was, with all these ports, and you're saying this is going to be a great city, but we have this terrible problem. We don't have water. And someone says, oh, well, let's just go 40 miles north, find this river, put a dam and bring. That is not an obvious idea. Someone had an imagination, they had a spark of genius, and they said, we're going to solve this. And maybe this is a crazy idea, but I think it can work. And convinced other people and built this thing. And what you pointed out, that the project, of course, has expanded, but now is providing water for 9 million people, is completely amazing. And I thought, Nash, you might have some thoughts about the quality of mind, because I also imagine working in an engineering firm or doing things like this, where you can see the beautiful results of your effort, has a certain impact on the people employed there, and also the dynamic among people, that there's a kind of, I would imagine, free flow of ideas and conversation. People get an insight and then they talk to someone else that they're working with, and then you come up with a new idea, and you can really make leaps in progress. So that's a lot, but what are your thoughts? Because I just think it's so amazing that someone came up with how to get this water down there.
Yeah, I think the credit goes to the freedom of, I mean, the companies had a lot of freedom, in thinking and developing, and the resources also, some of the companies really, so it was really focused to provide, improvement to the quality of life first, and the cost of providing it, and the profit margin was secondary issue always. And I know in 1970, when there was a recession, and I was a relatively new employee of the company, and I was worried about I'll be losing my job. And I talked to my boss. I said, I'm buying a house. He says, it's your choice, I mean, I can't tell you buy a house or not, but he made sure that he held on to the staff for 6 months to a year. If there was no work, we had no problem. He says he created work for us. The company was able to give us, some special projects, and they were not making money on that. But this was the policy of the company. The employees come first. Then the employees get dedicated if they know that the employers really trust them. So loyalty is there. But nowadays, of course, that thing has disappeared. The loyalty factor is not there, and the companies don't. It works both ways, I guess. So I think we have to inspire people to be really, to have the ability to work, and don't look for the. When I was working, I was told, don't worry about the cost. Come with a solution first. So that was the focus. So money was secondary. He says, I want a good solution. So we were never told to worry about money, how much it costs. But now the cost is very important when you're deciding anything. So I think that thinking should change to some extent for the.
Yeah, that's very true. In 2017, I attended a seminar in the city with all the experts on the MTA, because of course the subways have a lot of problems, and the signals are from World War II, which also I think indicates what quality workmanship we had at that time. But we shouldn't be using switches from 1940 at this point. And you also would think we would upgrade the track and trains, and that's a whole other story. But I went to a business breakfast where they had all these experts who were presenting their plans on how they were supposedly going to upgrade or solve the problem with the subways in New York City. And not one single plan took into account that we might have high-speed rail nationally or maglev, that New York might be a major hub of transportation between Philadelphia, DC, and Boston, and we might even have 5 times more people coming through Penn Station or something. There was no concept of growth at all. And you realize exactly people are behavior modified. Their idea is limited by what they're told the budget is, as opposed to saying, here is what we need, here is what we can project. And I don't know if I've said this to you, but one of the themes of my campaign is that we have to plan for the day that the United States is going to have 1 billion people. And we need to build infrastructure that can take care of that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. That's the future. I think we should plan, you know, I mean, and New York City, when you look back 100 years, was the prime example. It has the best tunnels and which have lasted over 100 years. The technology, they borrowed the technology from Europe and built it, and it has served and the growth and brought people to the city. And I think that futuristic idea should be maintained, you know, somehow, you know. I agree with the fast rail, you know, high-speed rail is an answer, you know, to our transportation need. So somehow, but lately there's been some trend to a private-public partnership in the several projects. And that has been very successful for building the Tappan Zee Bridge, for example. So maybe if you can get investors involved, you know, if the government doesn't have the money, so maybe that is one way of looking at it for larger projects where you know large sums of monies are needed and government don't have the funds. So I think that's maybe what, you know. So we have to be forward thinking and futuristic thinking, bold ideas. I agree with you, Diane.
Thanks. Chris, do you have any?
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, on the question of the public-private partnership, and you brought up the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that Biden is so proud of, but there's no concept of a mission. I mean, in other words, it's different to say we're going to throw $1 trillion at infrastructure in the United States. It's completely different to say we're going to build the Tennessee Valley Authority. We don't know exactly what it's going to cost, but we're going to build it. And we'll put out bids and we'll try to do it at the most cost-effective means or whatever, but we're going to build it because it's going to transform the entire South, 8 states in the South, from backwater, you know, disease-infested, you know, places where farms are wiped out because of flooding, with no electricity and no running water and no appliances in people's homes. We're going to transform it into a modern agro-industrial powerhouse, and we're going to do that. And that's what FDR did. I mean, that's what DeWitt Clinton did with the Erie Canal. That's what FDR did. That's what we have to do. So I think the problem in thinking about it from a standpoint of money is that it's not a question of money because you know, Nash, as you well know, there's, like Diane said, there's plenty of money for war. There's plenty of money for bailing out the banks. You know, I mean, they came up with you know, a quadrillion.
Quadrillions.
Yeah, well, we'll print gazillions of dollars to bail out, you know, derivatives at banks, no problem, right? But build some new infrastructure that's going to transform the nation and create better living conditions for the population? Hell no. Not interested. They're not interested. That's the problem. And so I think, you know, it's this idea of American system of political economy that Hamilton represented, that John Quincy Adams, that Monroe, that Lincoln represented. This is a real treasure in the history of the United States. And where you see that being employed now is in China, is in Russia, where they're actually thinking in terms of making credit available for great projects. China really is the best example of that.
Exactly.
Making credit, right? And it all has to do with vision, right? It's what's your vision?
Yeah, that's true. That is, my recent worry is the power need for the data centers. We have developed this artificial intelligence and chips which need a lot of power, and we may not have enough power to for this growth, and you cannot do it, standby generators. So you have to have a continuous supply, not from solar energy or wind energy. So I think the government is not thinking about that. I think
Right.
at this point, and I think that is going to be a huge problem. Suddenly, there'll be blackouts. So
Very soon, they're saying. Now, I have a question that came in from YouTube, who asked, can you say something about the tower at the Manhattan end of the High Bridge?
the tower,
Tower.
Tower.
the 9/11,
No,
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 no.
tower at
There's a,
the
there's a,
water. Isn't that a water tower at the end of the bridge?
no.
Chris, is that tower in the picture?
I don't think so. Let me.
Everything is underground. All the reservoirs right now underground. Uh,
Well,
so
what did they do with those reservoirs? I wanted to find out. While Chris, oh, here he goes. So,
Let's see here. There.
and way at the end, you can use your cursor. We could see it if you show it
Can
where
you?
it would be.
But I can't see the tower. Hold on.
The tower, there's a little house there.
There. I don't know. There may be a tower now. I don't know.
Let me clarify this point. I think you see, most of the water which comes from the dams and reservoir is by gravity. Only 3% of the water is pumped. So you have a pumping station, maybe some locations where you have to locally. So only 3% of the water is pumped, and those is pumping stations. Maybe that's what it is. To answer the question.
Good. Now, what were we saying?
We need a mission.
I know there was something else about these projects in the water, and now I can't remember what it was. But that's okay because we have to do this again.
One fun thing I was thinking is that, I mean, here you have one question that comes to mind. New York City, it's taking all this water from all over the place, right? Now, what happens if we build 2 or 3 new cities along the Route 86 corridor, and they need to use that water from that they're getting? Well, if Nash is able to build some nuclear power plants on the Hudson River, then you could get electricity and desalinate the water from the Hudson, and you could provide the water for Manhattan much more locally.
We had an Indian Point nuclear plant, which was abandoned, but
yeah,
it's unfortunate, and Long Island also. But I think the problem is the rising cost also, because it goes both ways. The regulations, one of the issue with the nuclear industry was the continuous change of regulations by the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, during construction. So they wanted to keep on upgrading the design, and which that cost money and add it to the construction cost. So, but now I think we have learned enough, so we don't have to change design during the mid construction. So hopefully, I personally think we should focus on some permanent solution, like nuclear power is an answer, which is clean, and it can. Lately, they've been thinking of smaller nuclear plants, like 100-megawatt plants. So there's a design being developed, so it can be put up in a small area, away from the population, rather than a huge, like 1,000-megawatt power plant. So maybe that is the way to go. Build small plants, in the rural areas, and then do transmission lines and bring power, in uninterrupted power, cheap power.
I think that in where Indian Point was, because they have the transmission lines, which is a big deal, that we should put some small modular reactors in that location.
You could,
Whatever can be done quickly, because everyone's warning about blackouts in New York. And especially if we start having electric vehicles or cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency uses enormous amounts of electricity, and people tend not to think about that.
I don't know, Dan, do you remember 1965 blackout?
No, that was a little before my time.
Okay, so you see what happened. So the grid,
1 year.
one of the grids.
Exactly 1 year before her time. Sorry, go on.
Luckily, I was not in that city at that time. I was away from the city, but I heard about the crisis which happened in the city of New York. People could not go home. The subways stopped running, and people, it was a complete blackout. And the reason of the blackout was we didn't have enough. One of the power grid broke, and suddenly, the system was collapsed. So they have fixed that, since that. So we don't have blackouts really now. So the grids are interconnected, but we're getting a lot of cheap power from Canada. Canada has developed huge hydroelectric dams and projects on the east coast, north of the country. So we are able to benefit from those. Because I think the hydro projects have beauty, but initial cost is high. But the maintenance cost, you maintain a plant with only 5 people, that's it. So that pays off, and as you can see, the infrastructure, the plant lasts 100 years or so without any problem. You have to replace some equipment, but. So obviously we have to have a broader thinking and long-term thinking where the power is going to come from.
Right.
I got the answer to that question. The High Bridge Water Tower is nearly 200 feet tall, and it stands around 174th Street in Washington Heights. It used to hold a 47,000-gallon water tank that was fed by the Croton Aqueduct.
Okay.
So that was part of the system. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. I want to really thank you. And Nash, thank you so much. And we're going to be talking more, because I think you're going to have to do some more lectures. Classes and tours, maybe tours.
Tours.
I wish I could. Yeah, I'll definitely like to help, before I lose my mind,
Hopefully that won't happen.
Thanks. It was really nice. There is a need, hopefully, we can get up, enough support, to for these ideas, for the future benefit.
Yep. Well, that is why I'm running for U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
So for people who are listening, please go to the website, sareforsenate.com, sign up to volunteer, donate. The campaign needs a lot of money, and I am not getting any money from AIPAC or any super PAC. So every nickel counts from all of you. And then again, for those of you in or near the 16th Congressional District in New York, you can get that leaflet on my website about the not selling the election to AIPAC. And Jose Vega and I will be mobilizing straight through primary day Tuesday to see if we can deliver a surprise blow to the $25 million foreign interference in the New York elections. So thank you very much. And with any luck, we will be back next week.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.